I'm gonna love you.
Welcome back to Dan's Chess Lounge, everyone. Today I'm going to be covering the playoff games between Magnus Carlsen and Anish Giri. I was really looking forward to this game here, both games, because the two players are relatively around the same age. They're both super GMs, great players, and they actually give each other a hard time on Twitter and through social media. They're always poking little jabs back at each other. It's more so Anish picking with Carlsen, even though Carlsen is the man. Everybody knows Carlsen is the best player maybe to ever play the game. He's incredible. He's just not like super flashy like a Gary Kasparov or a Mikhail Tal. But Magnus Carlsen is definitely a surgeon on the chessboard. And let's go ahead. It was a playoff, the best of two games. And if they were still tied after two games, then they would have what you call an Armageddon game. And that's where white is given more time than black. But if black is able to draw, then black is considered the winner because he had a time disadvantage. But that's only if the players are still tied after the first two playoff games. So let's go ahead and start off with game number one. Magnus Carlsen was white, and he started off with knight f3, the ready opening. Gary responded knight f6. Now you have c4 transposing into the English opening. This is both players' styles here. Both players like to play more of like a slow build-up type of position instead of like a real tactical from the start e-pawn opening where you have lots of trades right away and tactics flying all over the place. I mean, Carlsen can definitely play that way. He's the best player in the world. He can play that way, but that's not necessarily his bread and butter. So you have a slow build up here. Bishop b2, fianchettoing the bishop, putting it on a great diagonal here. Bishop e7. Players are just developing their pieces in the beginning here. c5 strikes out more space for black. You have an exchange in the center here. Knights come off the board. Now you have d4 striking out in the center. Queen a5 check. Carlsen blacks with queen d2, and now the queens come off very, very early in the game here. Just move 11, and the queens are gone. We have an endgame here. And this is Carlsen's style. He likes to slow play it, and he will grind you down. Knight c6. C takes, d takes c, bishop takes. And you notice the position on the board. You have an isolated d pawn here. This can be a weakness for black. White's idea here or strategy is to trade off the pieces and then go into like a king and pawn endgame and be able to exploit black having the isolated d pawn in the king and pawn endgame. Black needs to make sure that his pieces are very active and try to make up for the isolated d pawn, make up for the bad pawn structure by having very active pieces. That's the strategy. King e2, bishop e6, develops the bishop, protects the pawn. Rooks slide over. Carlsen has a great setup here. He's got both rooks on the open files here. One's completely open, one's semi-open. All very principled play by Magnus Carlsen right here. It's just textbook right here. This is how you teach beginners and intermediate players how to play. h3, a6. He makes the game look very, very easy to play, even though it's very difficult. As we all know, once we step on the board ourselves, then we figure out how difficult it is. It's not as simple as how Magnus Carlsen makes it look. Now you have knight b4, attacking the bishop and attacking the pawn on a2. The bishop retreats to protect it. You have an exchange of rooks. which is fine with Magnus because he wants to trade pieces and then attack the isolated D pawn. Doesn't go for that. Knight goes back. Now you have Carlsen expanding on the king side. You have an exchange of knights. Now the idea here for Giri was that what he was going for, he was thinking about exchanging rooks on c1. Carlsen is fine if he wants to do that. Bishop, so he plays f4, expanding more on the king side, getting ready to put pressure on the bishop there on e6, and then that pawn is going to be undefended. So Giri gives himself some lift or some air so the bishop can slide back in case Carlsen does go f5 here in the near future. So Carlsen goes to bishop g6, king f8, king f3. Kings are moving to just better their position, moving into more active squares. And in the game here, Giri played bishop b4. And just to note that now, if he wanted to exchange rooks on rook c1, it would be a mistake. This wouldn't be good for Giri to do now at this point because you would have rook takes, bishop takes, and then at the end you would have bishop c5. Now the king would have to flee to d8, and now look at this square right here. The white bishop can attack this square right there, the g7 square, and then that would be much better for white to play here. He's going to win a pawn over there. So he didn't do that. Giri played bishop b4, bishop d3. And then Magnus actually felt so comfortable in this endgame that he allowed Giri to exchange his weak isolated D pawn. That's how comfortable Magnus felt in this position. Giri plays bishop c3, bishop c6. Magnus takes the isolated D pawn, and more pieces come off the board. Now, I would just have to say that even though the material is even in this game, this is a much more comfortable game for white, for Magnus here, because if you look at the pawn structure, Magnus has his pawns on the light squares, which is the opposite color of Giri's bishop. So he doesn't have to worry about Giri's bishop attacking his pawns. Whereas on the other hand, Giri's pawns are on the same color as Magnus's bishop. All of his kingside pawns are on the same color as Magnus's bishop. So he has to be very careful of Magnus's bishop attacking the pawns. And then he also has to worry about the other side of the board, which we'll see here coming up. So this is just an easier, more comfortable position for Magnus to play. Magnus pins the bishop. Now this is going to be another weakness created because now it's going to create another pawn island for black. So that's more squares that black is going to have to try to defend with his king by himself. King d3. So now the bishop moves out the way from being taken, but that allows the rook exchange. And now you have 3 pawn islands for Giri. Now king moves over to c4. So now the king has to play like double duty. He has to try to defend the pawns on the king side, and then he also has to try to defend the pawns on the queen side. It's going to be difficult for him to do that. Now Magnus can exchange the bishops right here and go right for this king and pawn endgame, which is better for white. But he opts against it for the moment. He wants to improve his kingside pawns. See, he's such a technician when it comes to these endgames. He makes sure his position is the best that it can be before exchanging pieces. Now with this move here, let me go back one move here. Giri played bishop f4, but that allows Magnus to play bishop f8, which attacks the pawn on g7. And then Magnus does not take the pawn, though. Let me show you what would happen if he did take the pawn. If he did, the king would trap the bishop. And oddly enough, the engine gives this position a draw. It gives it actually 0.00 because Magnus would still get 3 pawns for that bishop. He would get the pawn that was on g7. He would also go ahead and eat the pawn on h6, and then the bishop would take back. But then his king would hurry up and snap off this pawn here on c6 as well. So he would wind up getting 3 pawns for the bishop, and that's still good chances for him to draw there. So the engine actually gave it 0.00. So he didn't play that. He played bishop c5 here. Now the king is heading over to try to snap off this pawn on a6. Now you have b4 as an interference move. Now the king, it's 2 different plans here. The king can snap off the pawn on a6, or the bishop can go to f8 and snap off the pawn on g7. It's just too much for the black king to defend both sides of the board. And Magnus goes for the pawns on the king side. And at this point here, there's really nothing for Giri to do. I mean, he can't defend. The plan is very simple here for Magnus. Magnus is just going to march his king over to the d3 square, and then he's going to bring his bishop to the e3 square, attacking the black bishop here. And if the black bishop moves, then the bishop is going to attack the h6 pawn, and he would drop the h6 pawn. So this game is pretty much over at this point here. It's just Magnus has to put the finishing touches on it. Let's go ahead and see how the game wrapped up. King c4. Like I said, the king is just marching over to that d3 square. That's where he wants to be. The bishop is under attack right now, so he moves the bishop. Look at that, king d3. Now you have bishop e3. And Giri resigned right here because, like I said, now Magnus would either take the bishop on g7 and then promote the pawn going forward, right? Or if the king ran over to this side, if the king ran over to try to defend, then the white king would head over this way and snap off these pawns over here. So it's just too much. So Giri resigned game number 1. All right, stay tuned for game number 2. Giri has to win this game to force an Armageddon game. So in game 2, the players switch colors. Carlsen's black, Anish is white. And don't forget that Carlsen only has to draw this game. He only needs a draw to win the whole entire tournament. So you'll see that a lot of the decisions that Giri makes in this game are not necessarily Giri types of moves. He's usually not as aggressive. So it makes for a great game to look at. Let's go ahead and dive in and see what transpired here. e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6. Okay, you have the Italian game here. Bishop c4, bishop c5, a Giuoco Piano, knight f6, d3, d6. Normal theory, opening theory right here for the Italian game. I like how the bishop is tucked away on the a7 corner. A lot of times when you're playing beginner and intermediate players, they completely forget about that bishop there a few moves later. Castles, h3, keeps the knight and bishop from the g4 square, h6. Now you have the knight, bd2. It's going to reroute to the king side, as you can see, via f1 to g3, and then sometimes it goes to h5 or f5 for a king side attack. Let me draw another line here, or here. for the kingside attack. So it's a reroute, it's a maneuver. Now you have bishop c3, c2, getting the bishop in a better diagonal for when the center opens up. The bishop would be on a good diagonal there, pointing towards black's king. You have d takes e, queen e7. There's the knight making his move, g3. Going for the kingside attack, rook a d8. There's the knight making his moves. You have all types of potential sacrifices ahead where the knight can, if he can get on f5, then he may be able to sack on h6 or g7. The king plays the f8. It's a defensive mover, like a prophylactic move. So, because the black knows that there's getting ready to be all types of fireworks on his king side. Now, knight h to f5 was played in the game. If the queen would have went to f3, the commentators were saying that they wanted Giri to play queen f3 because then there would be all types of sacrifices where if the bishop took on h6, then the knight would be undefended. And even if that didn't happen, like in the very next move, black would still have to look out for that and keep an eye on that type of sacrifice there for a number of moves. So the commentators, Eric Hansen and Jan Smeets, wanted him to play queen f3. But he didn't play that. He played knight h to f5. Carlsen played knight e7. And then Giri thought for a while there on what to do, and he decided to retreat the knight to e3 because he's trying to avoid exchanges, because the more exchanges that you have, the more pieces come off the board, and his chances for an actual attack diminish. And don't forget, he has to win this game. A draw is not going to do anything for him in this game. He has to outright win this game to get to the Armageddon game next. Carlsen goes to knight g6. Now you have knight f5, knight f4. Queen finally goes to f3. You have c6 here. Keep the knight out of the d5 square. Knight goes to g4. Now you have some exchanges here. Carlsen puts the question to the knight with g6. Giri trades, another trade here. And then right here was a great move here. Giri decides to sack the knight on f5. He played queen takes f4 instead. So, which is a good move. If you have to win, you're going to have to sack some pieces, especially against Magnus Carlsen. So he decides to sack the knight there, and Carlsen accepts it. He takes it. And then right here, it was another good move by Carlsen this time. He decided to give the piece right back. So the bishop there that's under attack, he decided to give it right back because there would have been a huge attack coming. Let me show you what would have happened if he would have just kept the piece. He could have went to c8, bishop c8, or bishop c4, or bishop d7. It's all the same thing. Let me just show you, like, if he would have went to bishop c4, the next move is f6. It doesn't matter if he would have went to bishop c8 or bishop d7. The next move by Giri would be f6, clamping down his king side, Carlsen's king side. And then after that, you would have e5, opening up the way for the bishop. Now you're going to have rook lifts. Excuse me, let me get this line out the way. That's not the correct line. Now you would have rook lifts. Then you have the queen participating in the action. So it would be a very miserable time for Carlsen here if he would have accepted that piece. So he decided to give it back and play queen g7 here. He would have had to calculate to perfection in order to survive that attack that was going to come. And don't forget, this is a blitz game here. They don't have a lot of time. I think at this point in time in the game here, I think they both just had maybe like a minute to a minute and a half left. So he would have had to calculate perfectly with just a minute and a half left. So he gives the piece back. with f takes e. Now you have rook takes. Now Carlsen kind of takes the initiative a little bit here. Because don't forget about that bishop in the corner on a7, hitting that f2 square. And now you've got a rook lift that's going to slide over. It's getting kind of dicey here. Now you have rook a to d1. Carlsen sidesteps that. Now the rook goes to e2 to try to protect that weak f2 square. The rook can slide over to rook f6, hits the queen, so then the queen has to move there, but then it's going to be trouble on that f2 square, so the rook moves to e2 to protect that square. Now you have Carlsen wanting the queen trade. He goes to queen g5 because, again, if he draws the game, then he still wins the tournament. So he's going to take the pieces off the game and go into a drawish endgame. Giri declines because he can't take a draw. Now you have the rook f6 move. Queen moves out the way. Now you have the battery here. You have 3 pieces on the f2 square now. So the rook moves over to f1 to protect it. Now you have a rook lift. The other rook, rook e5. Queen goes to h2. Now Giri realizes that his position is severely under attack, and he might even lose this game. So now he plays queen h2, wanting a queen trade because he doesn't want to draw, but he doesn't want to lose either. And his position is getting where he may actually lose. Carlsen declines. He plays queen g5. Now you have g3. Queen g4 hits the rook. Rook goes to d2. Now you have rook g5. e5 here is kind of like a clear sack to give the light square bishop more scope. He wants to attack. Now this was a mistake here that Magnus played. Magnus played rook takes e5. He took the sack pawn, but it was a missed opportunity though, because if he would have played rook f3 here, and the commentators missed this too, but like I said, it's Blitz, it's happening very fast, it's understandable. If he would have played rook f3 here, it would have been game over practically, because now you're threatening to take on g3 with the rook. You're threatening to take with the queen. You're threatening rook h5, hitting the queen. I mean, it would have just, because the pawn on f2 is pinned by that sneaky bishop in the corner there. So it would have been lights out there if he would have played rook f3. But he missed that. He played rook takes the pawn on e5 instead. Now the bishop goes to d1, protecting that square, that f3 square. More so than hitting the queen, it's really to protect that f3 square from those attacks that I just showed you. Queen g5. Rook d3 was played in the game here. Better was queen g4 here to try to promote the exchange of queens. That way that would kind of stop Carlsen's attack. But instead he played rook d3 here. He was probably worried about that f3 square with all those attacks again that I was showing you. Carlsen plays rook e5. Now Giri finally played queen h4. But this time when he played queen h4, he actually offered a draw. The players agreed to a draw right here. Giri was down to 8 seconds, and Magnus had 20 seconds left. And they both agreed to a draw here. A draw does not help Giri. Giri wound up losing the tournament because he needed a win to continue on and get to the Armageddon game. So Magnus Carlsen wins the tournament at this point here. Let me just show you how play might have continued. Rook takes f2. Queen takes. Pawn takes queen. Rook takes. And then rook takes. And then at this point here, after Carlsen would have swapped off that pawn on b2, Carlsen would have been better. He would have been up 2 pawns. So he would have went ahead and won this game, eventually won this game, if he had time. But again, like I said, it was Blitz. At that point, where Giri played Queen H4, he only had 8 seconds left on the clock. Magnus had 20 seconds left. So that wraps up and concludes the Tata Steel tournament. Magnus Carlsen wins it for the 6th time. It's an incredible feat. Magnus Carlsen is definitely the best player in the world. He's beating everybody that he plays. And it doesn't matter the time control. It could be classical, it could be rapid, it could be blitz, it could be bullet, it could be online, over the board. It doesn't matter the format. He's just clearly better than everyone right now. So, hey, I hope you guys enjoyed the video. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time.